Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to Al Mubarak Radio, and you are listening with our official partners, Interpal. Tonight, as you will probably know, it's we just gone past 8 p.m. this evening, and it's time for our weekly show called Real Talk, hosted by Dr. Abdul Basit Sheikh. And tonight, we'll actually be talking about social mobility and social mobility, especially within the context of the Asian Muslim community in the UK and Europe, for that particular matter. So, anybody that's actually wanting to contribute to tonight's program, whether you want to send a text, a message, or you want to WhatsApp, and or you want to call us in, these are the numbers to actually call us in on this evening. It's 01924 472 776, or if you want to text us or WhatsApp us in on 07868 476 577. So Real Talk again is here tonight, and we're actually talking about the issues that affect the Muslim community. So Real Talk reaches parts where no other radio station dares actually go to. So ultimately, what we're actually talking about tonight is the importance of social mobility. So basically, how I'm going to actually address this particular topic is, first of all, to actually define what we actually mean by social mobility. Social mobility has been talked about by many many politicians, many academics, many media commentators for several years now, about the fact that why is there an issue in terms of getting people from black and ethnic minority backgrounds, maybe people from the white working classes, why they're actually not breaking through the ceiling or breaking through the barriers and getting into the top professions, whether it be in the field, whether it be as a barrister, a solicitor, or even an academic, ultimately, or doctor or dentist for that particular matter. Why, even after so many years and so many millions of pounds being spent in the education sector, that we ultimately see that people from working class backgrounds, very few of them actually going on to become leading personalities in the various fields for that particular matter. So social mobility is all about actually ensuring that the people who are at the bottom of society, the most disadvantaged, ultimately are able to go to university and ultimately then go into great careers for that particular matter. So I mean, ultimately, if we actually look at the Asian Muslim community in the United Kingdom, we see that Muslims have predominantly today, I mean, they're approximately about 5% of the Muslim of the population in the United Kingdom is ultimately identifies itself as Muslim. So ultimately, what we've got to actually remember is that how far have Muslims actually progressed up the academic ladder and ultimately up the career ladder since the 1950s, when many, I'm sure many of our listeners, will have probably grandparents who probably have, passed away, or probably still alive, or great grandparents who have actually, who came here in the 50s and in the 60s for that matter. So ultimately, if we actually look at it historically over a period of, say, nearly 65 to 70 years, Muslims have done quite well. I mean, I wouldn't say every, vast majority of Muslims are in high flying careers. There's a lot of work to actually be done, but I think good progress has ultimately been made in terms of the fact that Muslims have actually progressed from very humble, very working class backgrounds or working class environment, and become have actually broke the glass ceiling as to actually speak, and made it into the top professions. Today, we have many Muslim barristers or legal professionals, like Nazir Afzal, for example, who actually is the Crown Prosecutor for the Crown Prosecution Service. If we look in the world of politics, for example, we have Baroness Wasi, who was born in Dewsbury. Ultimately, is a peer. Was the foreign minister in London for many years, and she's actually broken through the glass ceiling as well. I mean, if you look across the actual country, we see a number of Muslim men and women who we should not actually forget have actually done very, very well in terms of sorry about that, making a career or making a name for themselves in their various fields for that matter. I mean, today, historically, you see that many Muslims have actually gone into, gone to become doctors, dentists, barristers, solicitors, pharmacists. I mean, as far as my work is actually concerned in the academic sector in higher education, there needs to, there aren't that many Muslim lecturers as there would be in comparison to Muslim pharmacists, for example, or teachers, or even solicitors for that particular matter. So there are certain areas even today, after 65 years, that ultimately work still needs to be done in order to ensure that Black ethnic minority people actually are able to get a foothold, and actually get through the doors, to speak, and move in to those particular careers. So I think as a community, we should pat ourselves on the back, and in the sense that Muslims are making a contribution and have actually got into the vast majority of the professional fields in the United Kingdom. But that's not to say that the work has been done. And tonight's show is actually just to allow people to discuss this issue that, I mean, especially this issue is of very much importance to our politicians in the House of Commons, the political parties, the councils, and even our community organizations for that matter, because all these stakeholders have a role to play in order to ensure that people who have talent, who have aspiration, are basically able to fulfill their potential without their race or without their ethnicity or without their class actually being a factor. And ultimately, social mobility is something that needs to be looked at within our Muslim community as well. I mean, within our Muslim communities, we have beautiful community settings, community organizations, we have the mosques and the madrasas, but ultimately, are we doing enough from a social and a community perspective? That are we actually do we have enough strategies or plans in place to ensure that our young Asian or even young Muslim boys and girls ultimately are able to fulfill their potential without their backgrounds, without their socio-economic class actually coming into the equation? And I think as a community, we actually need to do a detailed study nationally in order to find out to what extent is social mobility working in the Asian Muslim community. Secondly, conduct research in terms of the fact that are there problems within the Asian Muslim community, that are sufficient numbers of Asian Muslims actually getting to university first of all, and then getting into the careers. Because today another issue we have is that you have many highly educated Asians and Muslims who have degrees but have never done a degree related job, equivalent job, or have not actually even got into a career, that they're actually doing jobs that they could have actually gone into after GCSEs or A-levels. So we need to look at the issues that why are there a large percentage of Asian Muslim graduates who are struggling to actually find work that basically represents the fact that they actually got an education from a higher education institution in the United Kingdom. And I'm sure most of us can identify people in our communities that they've got a degree, they may have got a first, they may have got a 2-1, but they might be driving a taxi, or they might be working in a restaurant, or they might be working in McDonald's. I mean, no, I'm not basically criticizing McDonald's, but ultimately you find that if a person who actually has a degree, ultimately, why, I'm sure the person concerned, for example, did not do a degree in order to work in McDonald's for the rest of his life. There must be a reason why he is actually or she is actually working in McDonald's or even in retail or even a call centers where many people, many you find many Muslims and even non-Muslims, struggling to actually find jobs in this current climate. So if anybody, I'm just going to basically pause there for a moment. If anybody wants to actually text in or WhatsApp us in, please do so on 0786 847 6577. That's 07868 476 577. Alternatively, if you disagree with what I'm saying, or even if you agree with what I'm saying, or if you have a particular perspective or a story to tell, I'm sure there'll be graduates listening out there who might be struggling to actually get a job related to their degree or related to the actual training and the knowledge that they actually have. Please give us a call on 01924 472 776. So that's 01924 472 776. So going back to what I was saying earlier, that social mobility, I mean, in certain instances, ultimately you do have your shining lights, as to speak, where a number of people, very significant minority, have actually made it into the top professions. I mean, whether it be academia, whether it be as in the field of law, ultimately you see only a handful of people who are barristers, for example, who are academics. I mean, normally you will see a lot of Muslims, for example, trained as pharmacists and actually working in that particular field, solicitors, teachers, for example, or even accountants. So we had there is a traditional stereotype that as far as Muslims are concerned, they're only either pharmacists or a solicitor or even a doctor and a dentist, for that matter, and any other career is basically shunned, for that matter. And largely we've had those stereotypes probably as a result of the fact that because dentistry and medicine actually generate or provide huge salaries, especially in one's later years, ultimately many of our parents ultimately force us to try and consider going into become a doctor or become a dentist, on the basis that huge amounts of money can actually be earned. I mean, there's a popular joke, especially within the Asian community, that ultimately if you don't become a doctor or a dentist or a barrister, then you're a failure. So ultimately, I mean, that's never ever, that particular statement has never ever been true, for that matter, because ultimately Muslims and non-Muslims, you need people in every single field, because otherwise, if you have a shortage of people in a particular sector, then ultimately causes issues and problems in terms of people getting access to services for that particular matter. I mean, for example, social work today, social workers has suffered for the last 10 to 15 years, where people are actually refusing to go into social work, and and as a result of all the scandals that we have in terms of the fact that certain people in care were actually neglected, or their welfare wasn't taken into account. So when certain careers paths or certain careers are actually stigmatized as a result of media coverage, then you have you ultimately have shortage of people actually wanting to go into a particular career because due to the fear of being vilified by by people in the wider community for that particular matter. But ultimately, going back to my the actual discussion tonight, ultimately we're looking at social mobility, that we're looking at the reasons of why is it that many Muslims are actually still not getting to the top, as to speak, in their various careers, and ultimately what is actually preventing them from actually getting into high flying careers. And another thing, why is it that there are not insufficient number of Asian Muslims are actually not, why they're failing to actually get into the top educational institutions. So I'd love it if I'm sure there'll be a lot of people actually listening tonight or watching us on YouTube. But ultimately, we need your participation in order to actually make this program a success. So ultimately, I'd be grateful if you actually could ring in. Anybody could ring us in on 01924 472 776. 01924 472 776, or text us or WhatsApp us. If you don't want to actually ring us, then text us or WhatsApp us on 07868 476 577. So I think ultimately what we've actually got to remember is the fact that working hard is one of the prerequisites. Having dedication, being able, being able to being prepared, ultimately to actually sacrifice one's own time, sacrifice maybe from a financial perspective. That, without these qualities, you're never gonna actually get to the top. So you need a good team of people to work around you. You need good guidance. You need dedication. You need to be able to sacrifice. Ultimately, you need patience. And these are qualities that our Muslim children, boys and girls, need to learn from a young age in order to prepare them for the world and whatever it basically throws at them in terms of its challenges for that particular matter. So ultimately, these are qualities that we need. I mean, you find that many, for example, many young Muslim boys, for example, are very good at playing football. They have exceptional skill, but you find that even within the Premier League, for example, or the Football Association, they say, why is it that Asian kids are not basically getting through? It's not because they actually don't have the talent, and I think, I might be controversial here in saying this, but I don't think I think a large percentage of Asian people, especially young children, especially when it comes to football, for example, have the skill, have the knowledge, and have what it takes to get to the top, but they're not prepared to put in certain, they're not prepared to sacrifice certain things in order to actually get to the top in the world of football, for example. And that's one thing that I've noticed, that many people within the Asian Muslim community ultimately want things. Some of them want things too easy, that they're not actually willing to put in the effort in, or willing to sacrifice. However, on the other hand, you have a number of people within our community that work very, very hard, that they will basically give 110% in order to ensure that they actually get to the top. I mean, obviously, you need a bit of luck as well. I mean, without luck, you wouldn't, be able to make it, or you need somebody to basically open the door a little bit in order for you to actually, make something of yourself, and basically get on the career ladder, as to speak. So ultimately, what we've got to actually remember is that without these qualities, it's going to be very, very difficult in order for someone to actually succeed. And I think, if you look at this social mobility issue, I think our communities need to basically start doing some research, or start doing some studies in terms of the fact that over the last 70 years, to what extent have Asian Muslims been able to get to the top of the career ladder, where there are the success stories, where are there issues, or where are there gaps, and why are, for example, is a particular career path and not many Muslims are going into it. Examine the reasons, examine the factors why Muslims are actually not getting into a particular field or career for that particular matter. And we also need to look at issues, if there are issues such as discrimination, racism, especially since 9/11, Islamophobia, are these factors that are basically stopping Muslims from actually breaking through the glass ceiling, as to speak. Because I think a couple of weeks ago, I was actually reading an article online, talking about the fact that it is becoming increasingly difficult for Muslims to basically even get basic employment, due to the fact that they have a Muslim name, have a Muslim identity. For example, a Muslim male sporting a beard, or a Muslim sister wearing a hijab, for that matter. That ultimately it's becoming that serious that many Muslims are actually being not even being shortlisted for interviews, let alone basically being given jobs. So I think there are a number of underlying issues that actually probably need to be dealt with, that are more serious, in order to ensure that people who actually have talent, who have aspiration, who have the potential, that their potential is actually, fulfilled for that particular matter. Because what we've got to remember is that in any economy, whether it be in the Western world, or whether it be anywhere in the world for that matter, you need to have highly skilled individuals that can actually contribute to a successful growing economy. If you have a percentage of people that have a potential, and their potential is actually being wasted, then ultimately it's actually bringing harm to the long-term development of any growing economy. In terms of the health of the economies right around the world, we find that the world economy is basically staggering along at a snail's pace, and the medium to long term outlook does not basically look good. So countries around the world basically have it in their interest to ensure that the people living under their rule ultimately are highly educated, or highly trained, in order to carry out specialist skills, in order to ensure that the economy actually grows for that particular matter. So it's very important that social mobility is basically addressed. For example, today, if you look at um, the banking sector, for example, in the city of London, or if you actually look at the field of law, for example, whether it be going to the bar, for example, to become a barrister, you still see today that upper middle classes basically dominate those professions. That the handful, the one or two Asians, maybe Hindus or Sikhs, or even to a lesser extent Muslims, actually go on to become barristers. And even if you look at a number of other professions, for example, as well, you will basically see that there is a big dearth or big shortage in terms of the numbers of Muslims actually going into those professions. And another thing I actually want to touch on that is that the fact that some people might frown, or people might disagree with what I'm going to actually say now, is the fact that we have so many Muslims that actually live in this particular country but cannot basically communicate in the English language, the language that they've actually learned from an early age, that they fail to actually communicate themselves in a professional manner when talking to others. Obviously we all speak, we all can speak street level English, or for example colloquial English or slang English, but ultimately some Muslims find it very, very difficult in order to basically make that transition, especially when they're in this a professional context or a professional setting, that they fail to differentiate the difference between colloquial English and ultimately professional English, or received pronunciation, RP, when dealing with people in a professional context for that particular matter. It's very, very important that, especially our younger listeners, students, that when you actually go for interviews, and when you actually go to assessment center tests, for example, that you actually communicate in a professional manner, and you use professional English, especially when you're actually talking to prospective employers, rather than actually talking to a potential employer as if you're actually talking to your friend, when you're having a kickabout in the park, for examples. It's very, very important that Muslims actually articulate themselves in a professional manner. They actually answer the questions that that they're supposed to, especially when they're going for interview or when they're going to assessment centers, because it's these little things that actually make the difference in terms of whether people actually get jobs or not. So ultimately, I'm not going to say that racism doesn't exist, or discrimination doesn't exist, or Islamophobia doesn't exist, because it'd be foolish of me to actually say that these. If I were to, it would be rather naive of me if I said that these factors were not an issue. But we shouldn't let these factors basically get us down, as to speak, in terms of trying to get up the career ladder. We should instead take it as a challenge, that there are issues facing Muslims today, but let's not let that be a monkey on our backs, as to speak, and basically make us feel downhearted, and make us feel anxious in terms of how we're actually doing at this particular matter. So ultimately, what we've actually got to remember is that it's very, very important that we actually work very, very hard. We work closely with councils, we work closely with the government, for example. And it's important that we actually do cooperate with government and government departments, because remember, the Muslim community is nearly 5% of the Muslim population. So where there are areas of concern where you can work with other people, the Muslims should have an open mind, should work with or organizations, whether it be at governmental level, whether it be at local government level, because our Muslim leaders and organizations have a duty to actually work with other stakeholders to ensure that Muslims in this country are able to fulfill their potential. So we shouldn't basically, we shouldn't feel like we are basically the odd one out, for example, or we are there's an elephant in the room, for that matter. We Muslims need to embrace those challenges facing us today. I mean, obviously, for the last 15 years, Muslims have not had it easy, especially around the world. We should take it as a challenge, and because we owe it to our children that whatever we can do in our lifetimes, hopefully that will basically make their experiences in terms of getting onto the career ladder, in terms of getting education, far more easier than we had to, especially during our time. For example, I'll give you an example. If especially where I used to live, which is not far from the actual studio, that I used to look, the people I knew that were about 6-7 years older than me were the first ones to actually go to university, and we actually looked up to them and said, well, if these guys can go to university, then we can as well. So ultimately, you find that the people before you, that come before you, ultimately paved the way for you, and then it works as there's a perpetual cycle, that people actually look at the people before them and say, well, look, yeah, he's one of us, he's from our community, he just lives down the road from me or around the corner from me, that ultimately, if he can actually become a barrister, or if he can become a solicitor or an accountant or a nurse or a midwife or even an optician for that matter, or even an academic, then ultimately I can. And it's all, it's very, very important that role models have people need to, people who have actually reached the top need to actually make themselves more visible in the community. I'm not saying that they've got to give up all the time and do everything for the community. That's not what I'm saying. But ultimately, there are many highly educated professionals in many Muslim communities around the country. But many of them, if you mention their name, you probably said, who's that? Or I've never heard of him, or I've never seen that particular person. So especially role models who have made it to the top in our community need to make themselves more visible, so that they act as a source of inspiration, that ultimately our children who are going to school at the moment, whether it be primary school, secondary school, ultimately going to further education, college, that they can see, well, yes, this person, he lives in my community, he just lives a few streets away from me, he went to this college, he went to this school, he went to university, now he's doing he's gone into this career, or she has actually gone into this career. Ultimately, then he acts as a source of, role models automatically become a source of inspiration, and then you inspire children that way. Subconsciously, that many children think, well, if he can do it, or she can do it, then ultimately I can do it as well. Because I can remember when I was young, and especially going through the education system, before I went to university, that ultimately I hardly knew any role models, or no role model from the Muslim community actually ever came to speak to me and saying, son, what do you want to do when you actually become older, or what do you actually want to go into, what interests you. And I mean, the only thing that inspired me was people who I knew who were a few years older than me, who went to university. That basically inspired me to go to university as well. And especially, parents again have a major role to play in terms of social mobility as well. That, alhamdulillah, today many Muslim parents are spending a lot of money on tuition as well for their children, which is a very good thing, because especially the tuition complements the schooling. From Monday to Friday, weekend tuition is very, very good because it allows the parents to spend money on tutors so that they can actually work on the weak areas of their children, whether it be maths or science or ICT, or even technology, for that particular matter. So ultimately, it's a good development that many Muslim parents are actually spending money now, and spending it wisely, because to spend money on education is, very wise investment, which will hopefully reap dividends, especially when the children actually go to good schools, or outstanding schools. If you use the Ofsted criteria, then going to, going to the best higher education institutions, the Russell Group universities, and ultimately going to, top high flying careers. I'm sure, most of our listeners, who have children, will ultimately, want the best for them. I don't think there's any parents out there that will actually want, bad things for their children. But remember also that not every child is academically gifted, or not every child will actually go to university. So that should not be seen as a negative. I mean, I'm always a firm believer that every cloud has a silver lining, that ultimately everybody has some sort of talent, that or something that they actually excel at. So we should devote our energies in terms of fulfilling a child's potential or child's talent, and ensure that they basically grow up being highly educated in religious knowledge and in secular knowledge, and ultimately being able to make a positive contribution to society for that particular matter. So ultimately, it's very, very important that, we actually look at this particular topic of social mobility. That how can we get more Asian Muslims into career paths or career fields that they are largely underrepresented in. I mean, for example, you will have many Muslims that are solicitors today, but only a handful have actually become barristers. So we need to look at the issue, that why is it that many Muslims are not actually becoming barristers or even QCs or Queen's Counsel, for example? Is there an issue? Are there factors that ensure that Muslims are not getting into the top fields, as to speak? That, we also need to look at the issue that are there enough Black and Asian minority people in the world of academia? So these factors actually need to be looked at within our communities, because I think within our Asian Muslim communities, I don't think we're actually doing enough in terms of publishing research, or actually doing research in terms of the fact that, how we can actually better the lives of our future generations, as to speak. I mean, we can't let the council basically do everything in terms of compiling reports. I mean, as a community, we need to have a long-term strategy in this country to ensure that Muslims can actually get to the top without, and counter Islamophobia, racism, prejudice, and, confront a whole host of other problems. For example, I mean, it's a tragedy that if somebody actually gets a degree and never actually does a job that is basically consummate with the qualification they've obtained from a higher education institution. I think, that's a, massive tragedy, and a number of people are actually in this particular situation at this moment in time. If any big request to our listeners. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of people actually listening and watching on YouTube, but nobody's been brave enough to actually ring in. So please, if you can actually ring in on 01924 472 776. I'm just going to mention the number again: 01924 472 776. Or if you've got something to say, a message, a comment, words of advice for our listeners, please text us or WhatsApp us in on 07868 476 577. Or you can text us on WhatsApp us in on 07868 476 577. So going back to what I was saying earlier, that social mobility is something that is very, very important. I mean, for example, for the UK today, to find that such a small percentage of people from working class backgrounds, whether it be white working class or from the black and ethnic minority sectors, that ultimately very few people have actually broken through the glass ceiling, even after so much money, time, and research has been done, and money has been spent in order to look at factors as to why Muslims and Asians and black people are actually not being able to basically break through those barriers. And I think some progress has actually been made, but I think a lot more needs to be done in order to basically ensure that our children are given assistance. I'm not saying that there should be positive discrimination. I mean, I'm not a supporter of positive discrimination. So for our listeners who are not aware of this concept of positive discrimination, I mean, in some career fields, that they've actually had quotas where certain number of black people or Asian people, or even underrepresented groups such as women, for example, certain organizations create quotas where they will actually, if a person from those backgrounds applies for a job, they will be given preferential treatment over a another person for that particular matter. So I'm not an advocate of positive discrimination. What I'm an advocate of is a level playing field, that irrespective of your religion, your caste, your race, for example, that those factors should not basically play a role in terms of whether you actually get a job or not. I think it's completely scandalous. And if organizations are actually engaged in this kind of behavior, then I think it's completely disgraceful, and I think it's completely uncalled for, especially in the 21st century. And I think our schools, especially our schools, and I think our politicians, and I think ultimately people from people from right across the professional class, I think they need to do a lot more in terms of working with people from disadvantaged backgrounds, from white working class backgrounds, white working class communities where nobody's been to university, work more with black and Asian minority kids, go into working class, in inner city working class schools, go into schools right across the country, especially where people have never been to university or never actually gone into a professional career. They need to do a lot of work to basically work with these children, actually show them, take them to, especially when they get to age 14 or 15, take them to a law firm, take them to a university, show them these careers. What does it take to become a lecturer? What does it take to become a dentist? What does it take to become a doctor? Kids need to be shown this, and role models need to go into school and talk about, what is it like to be a doctor? What does a doctor do in a typical 20, in a 7-hour day, for example? What does an academic do? How does a teacher become a teacher? Ultimately, these things need, there needs to be more grassroots level engagement, especially by those who have actually been fortunate and who are earning large sums and large salaries, that I think they owe something to the community, especially to those who are disadvantaged, who probably have got no chance of actually getting into a high flying career, that I think they owe it to them in order to basically do some work with them to actually ensure that it inspires the next generation of disadvantaged children, that they can actually become the next, multi-million pound earning barrister, or the high-flying academic, or the specialist surgeon, for example. So a lot more work, I believe, that needs to be done, especially by our community, and especially the experts in the various professions. For example, I think that a lot more work needs to be done in the working class towns and in the city areas, because I don't think there's enough actually being done for that particular matter. I mean, for example, if you look at Batley, for example, where Al Mubarak radio is actually based, I mean, even today, it's a complete scandal that 12% of people actually go to university, that only 12% of people have actually got a degree qualification. Compare that to some of the inner city suburbs in London. What you will actually find is nearly 80% of the people actually have a degree. So how on earth can you have such a massive gulf or discrepancy of people actually having or not having a degree for that matter. It completely beggars belief that people in this town, only 11% actually have a degree, and whereas you go to the various parts of London, you'll find that it's 8 times that number that actually have a a degree for that particular matter. So ultimately, something has actually gone wrong over the last few years, and I think people actually need to wake up and smell the coffee, as to speak, in terms of the fact that why do we still have this problem in many areas of the actual country? Why people are still actually not getting a degree for that matter in the early 21st century. I mean, I've had some words, colorful words, with some of our uh, budding, people who are aspiring to be politicians. I said, well, social mobility needs to be the number one priority after the, after obviously unemployment, to ensure that people who are from disadvantaged backgrounds ultimately are not left behind just because of the fact that they belong to a particular religion, particular race, or particular class for that matter. Because I think that's basically totally, uncalled for, especially in the 21st century. So ultimately, I mean, I've been now talking for nearly 45 minutes, and I don't think we've actually had a text or a WhatsApp or even a phone call for that matter. So anybody that's wanted to ring us or pass a comment, ring us on 01924 472 776, or ring us on, or text us or WhatsApp us in on 07868 476 577. So I'll just repeat the number again: 07868 476 577. I'm sure there must be people out there that's actually got a comment or that's got something to say about this particular issue we're actually talking about tonight, because ultimately this is an issue that's very rarely discussed in the Muslim community, unless somebody wants to prove me otherwise. But I've not seen many Muslim professionals, Muslim organizations actually talk about this issue, social mobility, within the Muslim community. And I think it needs to be discussed by our organizations, or even our national Muslim organizations. That a lot of Muslim organizations are doing a lot of great work on combating or countering Islamophobia, for example, or dealing with race hate crime, or dealing with anti-terror issues, for example. But ultimately, are we Muslim organizations, in my opinion, are actually not dealing with the issues that are going to affect the future generation. And social mobility is actually one of them. We can't leave it to the council and the government to basically provide strategies for us. We have to become independent and proactive in terms of actually finding ways, developing strategies to ensure that our Muslim children actually don't get left behind, and that we educate our children as best we can. We prepare them for the world of work. We prepare them for the big world out there, and it's actually our duty to do that. We can't just expect the teacher at the madrasa or the teacher at the school to basically do everything. We have to put time and effort and be patient in order to basically reap the fruits if in the long term, as to speak. So it's very, very important that we actually do our best in order to prepare our children for that particular matter. And ultimately, the only way we can do that is to actually push them to excel in education, and excel in their faith, and also excel in their secular studies as well. It's very, very important that we actually provide our children a well-rounded education, and basically expose them to Islamic culture, and especially secular culture as well, to ensure that they're able to basically stand on their own 2 feet and can actually basically survive and compete with others in the world. Because remember, we're living in an increasingly globalized world, that even for example, through Skype, through Facebook, through YouTube, for example, you can get to so many people across the world, which wasn't the case nearly 20 or 30 years ago, for that matter. So we increasingly live in a globalized world where the world even is such a huge place, but it's become a lot smaller as a result of the advancements within technology and the explosion of social media platforms. We have today compared to many years ago for that particular matter. So ultimately, in relation to social mobility, I think our organizations really need to basically get their thinking caps on and ultimately find ways of actually ensuring that Muslim children are not going to be left behind. Because I think in the current climate of Islamophobia, the constant suspicion that Muslims are actually under today, that I fear that this generation, the next generation, may well struggle to basically um, get into high flying careers as a result of the fact that they have a Muslim first name, a Muslim surname, and basically have an appearance as a Muslim, that they're going to actually be turned away or be deprived of a high flying career based on the fact that they are Muslim. And I really, it's really frightening, and it's a scary thought to think that a person could actually never end up fulfilling their potential just because they have a Muslim identity or a Muslim name for that matter. So ultimately, racism used to be the major problem maybe 30 or 40 years ago, where many, especially early immigrant communities and the first, second generation of Asians and Muslims were encountering a lot of discrimination, that they were struggling to get jobs, let alone get a place for an interview. Things improved significantly, in my view, in the 90s and in the early last decade. But I think ultimately things have taken a turn for the worst in the last 3 to 4 years now. And ultimately, it's been seen in the fact that people are actually struggling to get jobs, especially where they're applying, where they fill in the application form and they actually put their own name. So ultimately, these issues need to be addressed in terms of the fact that Muslims ultimately face an uphill challenge, face a massive challenge in order to basically get into the top careers, as to speak. But ultimately, it doesn't mean that a Muslim must basically forego his culture or forego his religion or abandon it, or abandon the culture or religion in order to basically get a top job. Because I'm always a firm believer that if you basically remember the Almighty, then ultimately the Almighty will actually remember you. So ultimately, it's very important that Muslims stand firm, be steadfast, preserve their religion and preserve their culture, and ultimately do their best in terms of basically making their own way in life, as to speak for that particular matter. And also, not every Muslim child is actually going to go to university or have a career, whether it be as a banker, as a dentist, or a doctor. I mean, you might find that some Muslim children are very good, with their hands in terms of creativity or the use of technology, for example. So don't place, our parents' big appeal to our listeners, especially those of them who are parents, that ultimately don't put too much pressure on your children to become something that they may not want to be. I mean, obviously push them. It's very important that you push them in order to fulfill their potential, but don't force them into careers that they don't actually want to do just because there's a lot of money or big salary to actually be earned on a yearly basis for that particular matter. So ultimately, it's very, very important that we, as Muslims, make sure that our children are, cultured, are fully aware of their own culture, Western culture, Muslim culture, Asian culture, have a high level of education, ultimately are able, to, obtain the relevant qualifications in order to actually get into high flying careers for that particular matter. So ultimately, it's very, very important that we work with our children, we work with our madrasas, schools, teachers, in both in both institutions, to actually ensure that our children actually fulfill their potential for that particular matter. I mean, ultimately, some people have done very, very well, especially coming from very humble backgrounds. But if you ask any of these people who become barristers or academics from a working class background, they will all tell you that they've had to sacrifice a lot of things in their life. Basically, had money struggles. Ultimately, have worked maybe 7 days a week for many years, juggling work commitments, study commitments. Ultimately, the journey is very tough and it's very hard. So there's no substitute to actually working hard, and you don't get your rewards without actually working hard, and nothing actually comes easy, and nothing is easy. For example, when we see somebody's doing a particular job, whether they may be sweeping the roads or they may be actually working in a shop, doesn't mean that that job is easier, that that person's not intelligent. It's the fact that we need, people are needed in all walks of life, in all professions, in order to basically make sure the world actually goes round for that particular matter. So ultimately, I think it's very, very important that we work together in order to actually ensure that we actually meet the needs and the requirements of the Muslim community actually going forward. So my final appeal is to Muslim leaders, community organizations, to actually create projects, especially for our young children, for them to meet Muslim professionals, in order to basically show them how you become a barrister, how do you become a teacher, how do you get into dentistry or medicine, for example. I don't think there's enough of that kind of outreach work that's been done within the Muslim community. Many universities are doing this kind of work, or many employers, but I mean, there's many Muslim professionals today. There's a lot more Muslim professionals today in the United Kingdom than ever before. So ultimately, it's very, very important that Muslim professionals make themselves visible, make themselves approachable, and actually, offer to provide support, especially for our young children, teenagers, those those people who are actually at our university or higher education institution, that actually work with them in order to ensure that the progression from a university education to the world of work is, the transition is actually smooth for that particular matter. So ultimately, Muslim professionals have a massive role to play. Alhamdulillah, there's a number of institutions that actually allow Muslim professionals to actually network. But I think these institutions maybe need to, I think there are also charities that do mentoring with young people as well. So some progress is actually being made in those fields where professionals are actually providing mentoring for our young people. But I think it needs to be grown on a far larger scale in the long term for that particular matter. Now we've only got 2 minutes left before it's the actual end of the actual show. So ultimately, it's been quite disappointing that nobody's actually rung in, or nobody's texted in, or WhatsApp us in. If anybody is listening, if you want to, we will allow you to basically propose topics as well, if you wish to basically, speak to, if you want us to speak about a particular topic for that particular matter, then ultimately, please let us know. So ultimately, real talk, only works when we have interaction from the, from the listeners. I'm sure in the past we used to have so many people actually text us in on WhatsApp us in, but I don't know what's happened. I don't know whether it's the cold winter nights that's stopping people from actually calling us in, or messaging us in. So ultimately, it's very, very important that we actually contribute towards this program. And please provide us feedback on this particular program if you think we're doing something wrong, or whether we're doing something positive or negative for that matter. I mean, I know this particular topic might not be of interest to a lot of people, but ultimately for me, I'm a passionate believer in social mobility, because I think that's the only way that Muslims are actually going to progress in this country for that particular matter. That we need to look at the issues that what's stopping many Muslims actually from actually getting into the best careers for that particular matter. And it's on this note that I'm actually going to sign out. So this has been Friday's edition of Real Talk, brought to you by Dr. Abdul Basit Sheikh. So I'd like to basically, before I leave, I'd like to thank Mr. Al Mubarak again for actually giving me the opportunity to actually present this show, Real Talk, on Friday night. So without a further ado, I would like to say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And ultimately, I hope to see you next Friday for the next edition of Real Talk.